provide obstetric service. It's not acting in isolation, it will maybe work in different sites. And the same for critical care. We're going to emerge as a department there. It's about the model that's been worked at the moment. It's about providing the right critical care support for maternity in that model. Last year, or the last 12 months, 3 patients had to go from maternity to critical care. And they were all very short-stay patients. So it's about, in discussions in that model at the moment, about how you provide that support for those 3 short-stay patients. And if they need more than that, that's safely transferred to the main critical care unit. So it's if I get the impression it's just about the unit, then it's about providing the right model of support for that model. You asked about capacity on the Q side. I think was that specifically about critical care or about inpatients as a whole? Sorry, I'll ask a question next, just for clarification.
It's about physical space, so I accept everything that Matthew said in terms of efficiencies that could be made, and that we're only talking about 25% of A&E attendances at Lewisham, and that some of that percentage will actually go elsewhere or be looked after in a different way. But it's about physical space. So what we know is that the A&E target at QEH is ropey. We know that there are 450 admissions to critical care at Lewisham, and I would argue that for maternity critical care admissions, usually they are probably life-threatening, and that's the reason why they're going there. And so any kind of transport across London would be clinically not sound. And so what I'm talking about is physical capacity, space, environmental space. I accept that bringing 2 organisations together, you'll get efficiencies with staff. What I'm talking about is physical space to actually house the people in good quality accommodation and without having delays in their care whilst they wait.
That's very clear. Thank you. So if you were to close, if you were to change the way that Lewisham ED works and move the inpatients tomorrow, then wouldn't you have the capacity to write? No, I don't think you will be able to do that. There's a number of things that I think that have to happen to make that work. Some of this will be about physical capacity. I think the ED at Q would need to change to go with the increased workload. I think that's why we're there. A lot, I think, hand in hand with what needs to happen within acute hospitals over the next few years. There's a great deal of work that needs to go on outside of hospitals as well. We know that many patients who are inpatients at the moment do not need to be in acute hospital beds. Some patients should not have been admitted in the first place. For example, someone deteriorating at home who perhaps needs to move to a nursing home. At the moment, for many reasons, they come to hospital while that's sorted out, and actually that's not the right place for them. Also, some patients who come to hospital and who are better and need to leave and need to go somewhere else and can't. And for example, in the last week, we've had up to 60 patients at Queensborough who need an acute hospital bed. So hand in hand with this, and this is a really important capacity, is the work in the community about making sure that patients who come to a hospital and a district hospital really need to be there. And that's important work, and I don't know whether our partners from Greenwich might want to comment on that.
Could I just add one quick final point, and I don't know if colleagues do. I'm mindful of other people want to ask questions. We've given quite a lot of information, so quite a lot in your question. So the one final point I wanted to make was about physical capacity, because you raised it specifically. Within the report, we allude to the need for some increases in spend on the estate in South East London to make these changes work. What we'll be doing as part of the final report is putting together, excuse the jargon, I try and use it as little as possible, but sometimes it's necessary in the way we work. But there's a transitional plan that we need to put together. That's how we get from where we are today to what the long-term plan would look like. That isn't going to take a couple of weeks, as you can imagine. That's a 3-year programme we're talking about. It will also cost money to run that system in parallel with the system we currently have. It will take time for people, and it will take more people to help us during that period. We're going to be setting out that work in the final report to be explicit to the Secretary of State and to the public at large what additional support we think in both buildings and in terms of the money you need to run the services on a day-to-day basis, what additional money we need on both those elements over that 3-year period. So exactly the point that you're making will be reflected in the final report.
Okay, there's a lady in the corner with a red scarf and a black hat.
I'm Ashley Marsh. I don't live far from here. Excuse me, I've got a personal allergy reaction. And I have spent time as an inpatient at Queen Mary's in Sidcup. And obviously you will have had some meetings closer to that hospital. Well, I'm sorry, I can only breathe as much as I can and speak as much as I can. I'm very, very concerned about this idea of a Bexley Health Campus. Clearly, the hospital there has already lost its accident emergency, and this seems to be a disaster to then contemplate thinning the emergency services even more. Especially when the Greenwich population, if you read local planning documents, is set to grow by hundreds of thousands in the next 5 years.
Is that we're not proposing any outsourcing of mental health services in this area at all. Oxley's Foundation Trust provide those services today. That's NHS services provided by an NHS organisation. That is not changing as we go forward. There's no reference to that in the report, and the reason there's no reference to it is because that's not what we are proposing. So hopefully that can alleviate some of your concerns over that, because there's absolutely no suggestion of that at all in the report. Indeed, we largely don't focus on mental health services, not because they're not very important essential services. Actually, I'd agree with your comments towards the end about the importance of those services. It's not that they're not important, it's just that we've been asked to specifically look at the acute sector, starting with South London Healthcare Trust, which doesn't run mental health services in the same way as Oxley's, for example, or South London and Maudsley. The mental health services on that site are provided by Oxley's Foundation Trust. So we've not been asked to specifically look at them, so we've not done so. But that, as I say, doesn't detract from the importance of those services. And I just want to confirm to everybody here that there is no proposal at all to be outsourcing those services. They're run by Oxley's. They continue to be run by Oxley's as part of this work, as part of the system going forward. You asked a question as well, made comments about the broader changes at Bexley. Now, I appreciate for some people that's a fair way away from where we are sitting today, but the health services are a connected thing. I think it's important, if you've had a question, that we just come back on it very quickly. The changes at Bexley are changes that have been worked on by the local council, by the hospital and by the GPs in the area for some time. We did a meeting last week in Bexley. We're doing another meeting later this week in Bexley, and the GPs locally are very supportive of what we're proposing. Yes, it's different to how Queen Mary's used to be a number of years ago, but proposing to create a set of services on the site that allow that site to be a vibrant part of the health service in South East London going forward, I think actually will be a positive outcome from this work. It's something that was proposed by the people working locally. We've endorsed that proposal, and it's something that I'm hopeful, if accepted by the Secretary of State, we can get on with quickly, because it's been in discussion for a number of years and it needs to be resolved and move forward positively. I think that would help everybody.
All right, lovely. Some more questions, please. Lady in black at the back row there.
Good evening, my name is Eleonora. I used to work for South London Healthcare Trust, and now I go as a patient there. I'd like kindly to ask you to elaborate about when you were speaking about changes, cuts, and modeling services, etc. How this would affect the staff, the workforce working at those sites, like Queen's Park, Lucian, etc., etc. And the second question is, I'm sorry, the second question is how, because different hospitals will provide different services, or they will overlap the services, and it will put in condition of competitiveness. So patient would choose where to go, and we might end up certain hospitals or certain sites to end up closing services because they're not profitable. because everything is a balance between efficiency and sustainability. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. First of all, on the question of changes to workforce, Matthew Kershaw.
Thanks, Gavin. In the report, Eleanor, I'm glad you've raised the question because it allows me just to give a bit of a flavour around one of the key elements of this work, which is how we make the running of services that are provided today run more efficiently. And what I mean by that is how we can make them better value for money, not reducing the quality of care, but by making them better value for money. What we've done in this work is we've looked at the services that South London runs today, and we've compared those services to those that are run by similar hospitals. So no hospital is exactly the same as each other, but there are hospitals that are more like South London and they're grouped together, and we use that group to assess a whole host of different things. One of the things that we compare them against is how efficient they are. So how much does it cost to run those services in South London for the amount of care provided to patients to the quality level that they need to. So we're not saying the way of doing this is by reducing quality or by reducing the amount of service provided. We're saying how can this be done in a more efficient way which allows the same amount of service to be provided as other organisations to the same quality but for lower cost. Other hospitals do that today. If you look at South London Healthcare Trust, out of its group of 18 organisations, there's only one organisation, and it's very close to it, that has a similar sort of cost for running the services. All the other hospitals in that group spend less money providing care to patients for the same quality, the same amount of care. So there is an opportunity for South London to improve its efficiency. We think that's, in the current climate, absolutely crucial because it's your taxpayers' money, it's my taxpayers' money, and what we're not saying for South London Healthcare Trust is that they've got to be the best performing hospital in the world. We're saying they've got to match the people who are at the top end of their type of hospitals, the average of the top three. We've said that's what South London Healthcare Trust should be delivering. That would deliver a very significant amount of improvements, and that's improvements that will then allow us to reinvest that money back into the health service. So it doesn't flow out of the organisation into some back pocket. It's actually allowing the NHS to then better use its resources, and I think that's absolutely essential in the current climate for a whole host of reasons as I've described. So that's how we've done the work. Now what that means is we will be, and I say there'll be more detail in the final report around this, but we will be saying in the final report the sorts of areas where we think those efficiencies could come from. So that would be, for example, improving the way that theatres work, as the film said. So at the moment, we in South London Healthcare don't use those theatres for long enough or well enough when they're being used. And it's a very, very expensive resource, these theatres. You may know that if you worked in the area. I know happened upon the example that you knew, which is either lucky for me or unlucky in a minute, you'll tell me. But that theatre programme is a key part of this work because it's extremely expensive to run theatres, and if you're not running theatres efficiently, then you're spending an awful lot of money to not get as many operations done at the end of the day for patients, and that can't continue. We need to see that improve. It's better done elsewhere. South London Healthcare Trust need to do that as part of this proposal. Now, will that solve all the issues in itself? No, it won't. But is it an important part of the work? It is. It's important because it's an area that the Trust can do something about now, and it's important because other people are already doing that. And in a situation where there is a finite amount of money and increasing expectations from the public, quite likely, we absolutely have a responsibility to make sure that we use all of the money efficiently. That means improving how we run services in the hospital. That's what we should do. Now, the second area of the question you raised was around choice and the impact on the future. It is true, there is choice in the health service now. Some people would prefer that there wasn't. I know that, and there are some people who will strongly hold that view that competition in inverted commas is a bad thing. My job here is I can't change government policy. I have to work within the the policy that exists. And so, yes, there is patient choice. And if you're running a hospital, what you need to do is provide the best possible care you can for your patients. And then it's up to the patients then to choose where they go. Will that be made more of an issue through these changes? I don't actually think it will in actual fact, but there are people who are experts in this who will look at what we're proposing in the report and give me a view about whether it affects patient choice. Patient choice is something that the government is very keen on allowing patients to have, and if that's the case, we need to make sure our proposals fit with that, and I believe that they do, although that's something that people will be commenting upon during that consultation period.
Okay, there's a gentleman here in the back, and then I'll come to you, Adam, just there.
Hi. I was hoping you to answer the lady's question regarding, Pete Murphy, GMB, and Local Resident. I was hoping you could answer the question about workforce. And you didn't mention about job cuts, redundancies, numbers, forecasts. Can you give us any ideas on that?
All right, thank you, Pete. So about specific numbers. Matthew Kershaw.
So there are some specific numbers in the report, but they are guides about the comparison, as I said before, between South London as a trust and what other trusts providing a similar sort of activity do. So basically there are more staff in South London Healthcare Trust providing the same amount of activity to the same quality as other hospitals around the country. And there's a figure in the report, I'll say it if Peter, you know it, but not everybody will. There's a figure of 140 medical posts in the report. That's not us saying 140 medical posts need to come out. It's us saying, factually, if you compare the activity and the number of staff who provide that activity in South London, there are more doctors providing that in South London than elsewhere. Now, what we've said in the draft report is that more needs to be done to identify what that means specifically in individual cases. We'll do some of that in the final report, and as part of the final report, I've already referenced it, there will be this piece of work around transition, and clearly within the transition, and I'll come back to why I don't think this will be as big an issue as you might think. If we do need to reduce staffing in some areas as part of this, then one of the things that we'll need to do is calculate an outline of what redundancy costs might be, because clearly there is a cost to that. But I wouldn't go to that point straight away, and the reason I wouldn't is because there's an awful lot of other opportunities in terms of staff changes in hospitals, which you'll be aware of, I'm sure. Just a couple of points on that. First is, in South London Healthcare Trust this year, they'll spend somewhere between 30 and 35 million pounds on temporary staffing, whether that be agency staff or bank staff. That absolutely is the area that you go to first if you're trying to reduce costs. £35 million, that's a very large number. So that gives us a big opportunity. The second is, health services are changing. So at the moment in this work, we're referencing investment in community services. One of the areas that I think will be very important, and I also think an opportunity for staff, is looking at different places that they work. So they might have worked for a long time with, let's say, elderly care patients in a hospital. Actually, it may well be better for the patients and indeed the staff to provide some of that care in a different way in the community. So there will be opportunities for people to do similar jobs or different jobs in a different way in a different location. So firstly, you look at back and agency, so reduce that. Secondly, you look at how you can redeploy people into the new areas where they would want to be working. And only if after doing all of that, you felt that there was a need for redundancies, then am I going to say there will never be any? Well, no, because the moment I say that, you can write it down and then tell me later on that we weren't true to what we said. So it absolutely is a possibility, but it's an awful long way away from going to there first. There's plenty of other things that we can and indeed should and will do as part of this work, and work with the staff side, unions, representatives and the staff themselves as part of this work going forward. I don't know, Annabelle might want to say something about that community services specifically.
This is Annabelle Byrne, the Chief Officer for Greenwich Clinical Commissioning Group.
Just to pick up the point about workforce, that in the attached to the report is a community-based care plan, which we've put together across the 6
clinical commissioning groups, which are for each of the boroughs for South East London. And we're working with the Local Education Training Board, which is newly established, to look at how we can ensure that staff with skills within a hospital setting who are actually needed to enable us to implement the community-based care plan can actually go through some retraining and some transfer. And that's something which they're very pleased to be working with us. They only come fully into being next April, as do we, but we're already looking at how we could put appropriate plans in place so that if there were staff who were no longer needed within the acute setting, we would retain their very important skills in a community setting.
Thank you. Annabelle Berner, the Chief Officer for Greenwich CCG. And there's a lady here as well. Yes, second row back on the aisle with red hair. Yes.
I haven't done my homework, so I probably need one question. I'm Felicity Code, I'm just a local resident. I just want to know, I've not come across the term health campus before, so I know somebody over there talked a little bit about it. Can you just explain, you're doing some kind of outsourcing option, but why is that more efficient than a hospital and quite how it works? I don't know.
We've had a lot of questions about the single campus over the last few days. Stefan.
I'll just pick that up quickly. Certainly from our conversations in Bexley, we had a long discussion about it, and quite a lot of feedback actually from people that they didn't like the term that was used. And as Matthew said earlier, it's a vision for the site and the hospital at Queen Mary's that's been around for a good few years now, generated by the GPs, the local healthcare commissioners, staff that work in Queen Mary's, and the local authority that sort of come together and work together over a period of time to find a way to help the Queen Mary's site thrive and have a sort of vibrant future. And I think the first thing to say is that they're not wedded to that particular terminology, so if it's unhelpful and people agree it's unhelpful, or maybe others think it is helpful, do fill that in your consultation response and we'll take account of that. But essentially the idea behind it is a location that will have a variety of health services on it. So those services might be provided by different providers, different NHS providers. At the moment already South London Healthcare delivers services from the Queen Mary's Hospital site, but so does Oxley's NHS Foundation Trust. And one of the proposals in the draft report that we've put together is for Guy's and St Thomas's Foundation Trust to also bring some cancer services there. So another NHS provider is Dartford and Gravesham that could play a role there as well. So it's really about a single location, a geographical location with a number of different services provided by different bits of the NHS from that site, or indeed the voluntary sector. And again, in the past we've talked about Macmillan nurses working from sites such as that, and other people that help us provide healthcare. Thank you.
Seems campus is not an overly liked word over the last few days. Okay, there's the gentleman just two behind you there in the emerald green jumper. No, yes, with the glasses.
I think I've got that jacket on. Didn't recognise myself. I'm Alan McCarthy. I'm a local resident here in Charlton, but I'm also one of the councillors representing Charlton on the Greenwich Council. Three very quick questions. First of all, in your final report, Matthew, is it possible that you could change which hospital loses its A&E to urgent care? Secondly, is urgent care as interesting, challenging and as attractive to work in for, say, doctors as A&E? In other words, will we attract and keep staff? And thirdly, could you share with us your testing or methods of testing and how you've achieved your thinking on the adequacy of public transport for both patients and visitors that, given this area, will be necessary with your proposals as they stand? Thank you.
Right, thank you very much indeed. Three to get stuck into there. Actually, yes, Matthew Kershaw.
So I'll start, and just spread it around because people get bored of listening to me ramble on. I think Chris and colleagues might want to make a comment about the clinical side, and Steph and I can cover transport between us past Steph starting. So in terms of could we change the recommendations, well, the short answer to that question is yes, because if I said no, then there would be little point in doing a consultation in its totality. What we've set out in the draft recommendations are what we believe to be the most appropriate ways forward, and we've looked carefully at it. So the choice of the changes in emergency care at Lewisham. It's not something that we've just happened upon. It's something that the clinical advisory group that Chris is a member of have looked at in detail. It's not a decision made on one provides better quality of care today than another, because actually you can't differentiate between the two. It's not actually about a financial case today. What it is by saying if we were to make changes to make the clinical service in emergency services fit for the future, to meet the clinical standards that are set down by London, where's the best place for us to make the changes to deliver those standards? The view is, from the clinical advisory group, that based upon a number of factors, that would be Lewisham. That's a lot about access and travel times, and it is also to do with deliverability and overall cost. So we've come to that conclusion based upon a significant amount of analysis. We could, if lots of people suggested that was wrong, look at that, and we will look at it and do that during the consultation, and we could obviously make a change. I think it's unlikely that we do that based upon the fact that we've gone through this in a lot of detail, but it would be wrong of me to suggest there could be no changes to the recommendations. What we are bound to by the consultation is to listen to what people say and to listen to what they say and help us improve the recommendations. It isn't a referendum on the recommendations, so if everybody said X about one part of the recommendations, that doesn't mean to say that I then have to absolutely take that completely in the final report. I need to reflect on what people say, I need to reflect on what the professionals themselves say, and I need to come to a conclusion to pass it to the Secretary of State for him ultimately to make a decision. The consultation responses themselves will be in the final report, a summary of them. So clearly if there is strong feeling around part of this report, which clearly there are, that will be reflected in the final report. But I have to make a judgment about that information and all the other information we've already taken into account, and anything more that we take into account before making a final choice for the Secretary of State.
And regarding your question about the urgent care being attractive to staff as in more than A&E, I think probably Dr. Chris Palin, and then I'll introduce somebody else that's very kindly agreed to come in who might want to also talk about that. Dr. Chris Palin first.
So, as I think has already said, Lewisham themselves believe that approximately 78% of patients are currently tender A&E and we manage to an urgent care centre. So the type of patients who wouldn't go there in the future if the proposal was accepted were only a very small portion of the sickest patients. So I would argue that the vast majority of work would still go there, and in a sense, would that be attractive for the staff? I think probably yes, it would be. It's slightly different to a full ED, but it's, as I'm sure you're aware, many urgent care centres excuse me, are managed and care provided by primary care rather than secondary care. And there's an urgent care centre already in place in Lewisham that does that, so which I've actually used myself as my local hospital, so and regulations too. So I think for the staff that currently do that, I don't think that would be very different. The proportion of staff who are involved in that small group of sicker patients would clearly not to be there in that future model, and would their skills that they develop over years would be well utilised elsewhere in the patch.
And in the front row, very lucky to have Professor Stephen Powis. Now, he's the Medical Director of the Royal Free Hospital NHS Foundation Trust. And if you're thinking, well, hang on a minute, the Royal Free, why is he here? Well, because although this is a unique process, other parts of London are also going through or have gone through changes to the way they operate. Professor Stephen Powis.
Thank you very much. So one of the reasons I'm here is because you may have seen in the consultation document Matthew had an external clinical panel, and I was a member of that external clinical panel along with some of my colleagues from out with this area of London and elsewhere in the country. So our role was actually to challenge the clinical design teams in South London as they came up with models. So some of the questions you asked Fiona are around critical care and maternity, exactly the sorts of challenge, as you might expect, that came back from the external clinical panel to the teams here to ask, have you thought this through? Have you got that connection right? And we will be continuing to meet to provide that external panel, which is distant from the local system here, but which brings with it knowledge of what's happening elsewhere in London and also elsewhere in the country. But you asked, so I thought I might just comment on your specific comment you made, which was, will the staff find it as exciting or as interesting to work as an urgent care centre as an A&E? And I think that's an interesting point, because actually, I don't watch Casualty on a Sunday night anymore, but I think A&Es are actually, for many staff, not as the exciting places that sometimes they're made out to be. It's a very stressful environment, and the medical and nursing staff there are really working flat out a lot of the time to a very demanding set of circumstances, and it's not for everybody. So in fact, as a medical director of a big London trust, I actually worry about where we're going to get the doctors and the nurses for the future to work in those sorts of high stress environments. And actually there are doctors and nurses who I think would just as well like to work in urgent care centres, because they find that a more attractive way of working. So I don't think it's an either or. I think people will be as attracted to urgent care centres to work as A&Es. I think the second point there is one of the things that staff often tell us is that they want to work in an environment which can produce very high standards of clinical care. And often that's about critical mass. So one of the things that drives this process, our consultation, is about critical mass and getting specialist services in particular at a mass where there can be enough people there to provide a round-the-clock service and to work as a team. And at the moment, in a lot of places around London, in fact around the world actually, those units and critical masses are too small. You need the volume of cases going through to provide the experience, you need the volume of critical mass to provide the team working and the expertise. And I think that's one of the things that absolutely underpins some of the changes recommended here.
Thank you very much. Professor Stephen Powers, the Medical Director of the Royal Free Hospital. And you also asked, Councillor, about the transport and the methods of testing that. Just to dot the I's and cross the T's and complete all your questions, I'll start off with Stephanie.
Thank you. I'm glad you raised transport, because I think it's a really pertinent issue and one that people quite rightly are raising. And I suppose that with any change, if it was very easy and everything was fine, we'd have done it years ago, and we wouldn't be having to hold big public consultations. There's always going to be a downside, and I think transport can be seen as a downside, and something that we therefore need to take extra care that we address collectively, not just ourselves in the NHS, but as the wider sort of public sector system, I suppose. I think the first point I'd like to make, though, is that for the vast majority of people, their interaction with the NHS and the care they receive will probably be in the same place that it is now. We're talking about the most critically ill people seeing some changes. Most of us actually encounter the NHS through our local GP and perhaps through outpatient appointments, and for some people surgery, whether that's planned surgery or emergency care. So the vast majority of people won't see any change, but some will. And again, going back to just the emergency care and the impact that that has on transport, we're talking about the most critically ill people that would currently attend an accident and emergency department having to go elsewhere. And in that scenario, again, the vast majority of those people would be transported by blue light ambulance. So whereas transport starts to be a worry, actually for the most critically ill, someone else will probably take care of that for them. And the modelling that we've done and the work that we've done shows that 99% of people across South East London will be within 30 minutes of an accident, a full admitting accident and emergency department, which is well within the clinical guidelines that have been set. So for that real emergency care, that's the situation on transport. There's another side, though, and one that we recognise, and that's around some of the changes we're proposing around planned care, which is when you have an appointment date to go into hospital to have an operation. And we've got proposals to change some of the locations for that inpatient overnight stay surgery, not the people that would have their surgery on a day case basis, which is actually 70 to 80% of surgery that takes place is on a day case basis, and that would happen as it does now on current locations. So again, for a very small percentage there would be a change to move to a different location for their overnight stays for inpatient care. And I think their transport is the downside. Some people will have to travel longer, and their carers and relatives might have to travel a bit further to come and visit them. But I think we should just put it in perspective as to the numbers, not belittling the impact it has on the individuals. So, just to sort of take that forward, yes, we've absolutely considered transport issues, and we're hearing it from the work that we're doing, the discussions we're having, that it is an issue for people. And just next week, Matthew and colleagues have got a meeting with the Mayor of London to talk about transport and to see how that can impact on the work that we're doing. And we've even got down into the nitty-gritty of looking at bus routes and which hospitals they stop in front of and which they don't. And as well, there's another issue around transport, which is around patient transport services, and again, building that into some of the capacity and transition planning that we're doing. But I'd ask anyone that's got a concern about transport to write it down as part of their response to the consultation, so that we can take that on board and feed it into the wider piece of work we're doing.
I do know there are a number at the front in each group who want to ask a question, but I'm going to go to the gentleman who's been the most patient of the evening. Yes, you, sir, with glasses at the back. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Alex Grant. I'm Labour Councillor for Blackie Western Ward, which is a bit of Blackheath, it's Greenwich. Though, as regards Lewisham, the residents of the area regard Lewisham as a local hospital as much as QEH is, so they're concerned about the proposals of Lewisham. But my question is about stroke services. My mother had a stroke about 6 years ago and received some pretty poor treatment at QEH, which I won't go into detail of, but shortly after that's happened, there were improvements to stroke services in South East London, and King's became the centre of excellence for stroke services, and I believe all stroke cases are currently sent straight to King's for treatment. And the NHS guideline, which is that all suspected stroke patients are given a CT scan within a couple of hours of admission, is being stuck to, I'm told. Your report doesn't go into a great amount of detail about stroke services. You completely appreciate you can't go into detail about everything, but it seems to indicate on page 38 of the full report that the current specialisms of hospitals in South East London will remain the same. Can you assure us that in the future suspected stroke cases in South East London will have a CT scan within 2 hours, as the NHS standard stipulates, and that stroke services will continue to improve and not get worse? Thank you.
I think Matthew's going to start on this, but I know Dr. Chris Palin wants to come in too.
So I'll start with a couple of general points, and then I'm sure Chris, who knows the service well, will add. So we were clear, well, we tried to be clear, are we clearer still in response to your question, that the way that emergency services in a number of areas have changed over the recent couple of years is something that we want to endorse and support through this report and not change. So stroke services, it's not exactly true that all patients go to King's, because there are two jargon, apologies, hyperacute stroke units. That means somewhere where you can go for the most critical stroke care in an emergency. There are two locations in South East London. One is King's College Hospital, as you say. The other is Princess Royal University Hospital at Bromley. So if you're in the south part of the patch, then you'd go there, and if you're in the north part of the patch, clearly you would go to King's. So we're not proposing a change to that. That's been a good, positive model. It has seen real improvements to care. We want that to continue for scans, but also for for treatment if that's what's required. And so that's something that we want to absolutely sustain through this work, and that's what we will be saying and have said so far. That's also true of where you go for a heart attack centre, where you go for vascular care, and also where you go if you had a major accident. Such would, let's hope we don't. But if you had a major accident and had a major need for what's called trauma services, that's also concentrated at King's College Hospital. This is very small numbers of patients needing the highest possible level of support from senior doctors, nurses and others. That's provided in specialist centres. We think that's the right model, and that's what we would be making sure continues through and past this work. So in short answer, yes, we would want that to continue as the way that you set out. I'll pass to Chris, who might want to add a couple of quick points.
Hi. The hyperacute stroke units at Crewe, I don't know the exact numbers, but I know that they also meet the same standards that King's currently do for the quality of stroke service provided. So, and certainly wouldn't wish to see that change. I think as a whole example you've raised actually demonstrates the importance of a small number of units providing concentrated expertise and high quality care, and patients having to travel further for that to get better treatment. I think the days when everyone provides everything locally are not going to meet the needs that patients deserve and should get. And I think it does support the idea that is the direction of travel of acute care is perhaps a bit further, but for a centre that can provides really high quality care.
And Professor Stephen Powers as well.
So I think that's a really important example. I'm really glad you brought up stroke, because 6 years ago I would have sat in meetings actually with local councillors and local people in North London, but I know it was the same around all of London, where they said, why on earth are we closing or moving our stroke services to a fewer number of stroke units in a smaller number of hospitals that in many cases are further away than where I would have gone before. And the local councillors said, my patch of the woods would say, we demand that you keep your hyperacute acute stroke units open. 6 years on, what I hear from actually local residents and hear from local councillors is exactly what you just articulated, that actually now they demand the treatment that the hyperacute stroke units can give, which is world-class care. Actually, London is way ahead of the rest of the country in this, and the residents of London probably get the best stroke care when you have an acute stroke in the UK, and very possibly in the developed world at the moment. We have a stroke service. It's now the envy of countries, of cities in the United States, for example, where they haven't done this. So it's a really great example of what I was talking about earlier, about getting to a critical mass for specialist services where really world-class care, very top level of care, can be delivered consistently all the time. So heart attacks is the other example. If you have a heart attack outside one hospital, you may well be taken immediately to another, where within 30 minutes they'll have the catheter into the heart to unblock the clot that you've got in the blood vessel in the heart. When I was training, that would never have happened. We were never a million years near that. And the trauma centres, getting people to major trauma centres quickly is another example. So it's this trade-off between what's local and what can be provided in really high-quality care. And London has really set the example here to the rest of the country by showing that we can do this. It's a really important point.
Professor Stephen Powers, thank you. Now, there's a gentleman in a blue shirt in the second row in the middle. Yes, sir, you with the greyish tie, I think it is.
Greyish tie? Blue and yellow tie, actually. Not that I'm a supporter of the coalition. David Gardner, I'm chair of the Chance Society and live, in fact, the other side of Charlton Park from the QE. Just firstly want to say that actually there was a degree of concern, certainly among Charlton Society members, when you were appointed. But I think my view is that of all the possible options, in overall terms, actually, it's actually, given the constraints you operate in, it's probably quite a good report. And of certainly writing off a lot of the debt, strategic reorganisation, I think is a sensible one. And I think locally many people are reassured. That having been said, there remains, and this is one of my questions, there remains quite a deal of obviously adverse publicity around the very fact there's been an administration, the publicity around the debts and so forth, and many people therefore think, well, the local NHS is not up to very much. Of course, people that use the NHS generally know something very different, to know that medical outcomes at QE, as well as other hospitals like Lewisham, are in fact good and getting better. And that has been significant improvements. There may be different issues with finances, but medical outcomes are good, and most areas, with one or two exceptions, perform well and are improving. But how you communicate, don't read that in the report, or at least it wasn't in the introduction and so forth. I must have skimmed over the part which actually promotes the local NHS. And I say that because the future sustainability of whatever structure we have is going to depend on CCGs and GPs and patients wanting to go for operative procedures where they need them to local hospitals, as opposed to other hospitals, obviously not for acute conditions that we've just been talking about, which will be treated in specialist centres. So that means building up the confidence in the performance, the confidence of the staff, the morale of the staff, local GPs, and the whole community. And how do we get that through? And I think this has been one of the downsides of this process, that we've not necessarily been projecting just how good our local NHS is and how much better it could be. That's my first point. And second is not a question really, and I want to know how that will be, how you will address that problem, which clearly is a challenge. And secondly, and I appreciate other people have asked this before I came in, on the accident and emergency, obviously locally we're pleased that Queen Elizabeth will retain an accident and emergency facility, and hopefully it will be enhanced because clearly it remains under pressure, although there are issues in terms of staffing over weekends and so forth, which you pinpoint at in the report. But I know many other people do have a strong concern about the impact of the closure of Lewisham A&E on QE, which already is often at capacity, particularly at stress times. Obviously, there's a huge impact on people in Lewisham, which I'm sure they have and will express to you, but on the impact also at QE of the closure in Lewisham. And one of my concerns actually is very often government departments, and the NHS are slightly different, take quite a narrow financial view, is what is right for their budget, not looking at what is overall right in terms of public spending as a whole, but what is right in terms of making the best use of your budget rather than the impact on people not getting to school, on people not getting to work, on additional transport costs and so forth caused by. So I wonder, have you looked at the wider issues in terms of the reducing the number of A&Es locally from 2 to 1? And have you looked at the economic impact of people losing time from work and so forth? So the wider economic impact, as well as the terms of people's faith and sense of ownership in their local hospital and NHS, which is so important. And I wonder whether that part of the recommendations could be deferred, because I think we all appreciate in the years to come, as everyone is registered with the GP, hopefully, and fewer people present themselves at A&E, there might be more opportunity to rationalise the service, but I certainly don't see that in the short term.
All right, thank you very much indeed, David. I think we'll come back to do the the A&E part second, because we did do quite a lot of that at the start. It might have been before you came in, but about the fact that there's so much adverse publicity, whereas actually we need to promote what is already good within the NHS locally. Matthew Kershaw.
Thank you. Part of you have heard about this before, but I have 2 jobs here in South East London. One is to lead the team who are working with me on producing the draft report and then the final report. And the second responsibility I have is to be accountable for the day-to-day operations in South London Trust during this period, so between July and when this work concludes, end of February, March time next year. And as part of that work, I've worked really closely with senior clinicians, doctors, nurses, other staff around the hospital to find out how things are working today, to help me with this work, but also to identify some of the very strong positives that are happening now, and also some of the areas where there need to be improvements, because both of those things exist today. There are some fantastic services being provided, there's some real improvements that have been seen in recent years, but it would be wrong to suggest that there aren't further improvements. I've never worked in a hospital, and they might have worked in the health service for 20 odd years. I've never worked in a hospital that can't do better, but to be fair, there's been a lot of improvements made, and I think the reason I labour that a little is because I've seen that and I have spoken about it a lot. But as you can imagine, me speaking about it a lot when I'm also proposing a significant amount of changes in the way we are in the report, it sometimes gets lost a little bit in the message. It's something that I've worked really hard on with staff internally, because I think that's a really important piece about maintaining morale, as you absolutely rightly flag. I think it's also important, and we tried to reflect it in the report and on the film, about how we have seen some positive aspects of what's going on now, but there is an issue here that if we don't make the changes that we're setting out, the ability to maintain that improvement going forward is seriously questioned. So it's implicit in what we say that there is good stuff going on now. Perhaps in hindsight we could be more explicit about it, and I take your challenge, David, for the final report, perhaps to be a bit more explicit about that, because it certainly is something that I've seen. We've got to get a right balance between saying everything's fine now and no change is required, which I know isn't what you were saying, but there's a danger some people will see if you're too positive about something and somebody's going to say, well, why do we need to change? Well, the reason we need to change is because despite everybody's best efforts, Trust is still losing over £1 million a week, and if that carries on, then the improvements made will be seriously undermined. So we have to get that message right. We'll look at it again for the final report, and that's one of the benefits of doing these events, is that it's giving us some ideas and thoughts for how we actually construct that final report and reflect on some of the comments made. So I thank you for those comments. Steph might want to, I can see her desperate to come in. I suspect she's going to reference about health and quality impact assessment and how that will address some of the issues that you were facing.
I'm so sad, I'm so into it that I'm desperate to come in. Just a couple of points for me. I just wanted to say on the sort of more obvious publicity, the media coverage around the changes that we've made. I think it is stating the obvious, but of course the media will cover the negative side of things far more easily and far more loudly than the positive side of things. And I guess the facts are on the table that the South London Healthcare NHS Trust has got the biggest deficit in the whole of the NHS across the whole of England at the moment. So it's not all good news here, albeit that the quality of services are not in question at the moment. It is the finances that have been the trigger, and of course the media are going to pick up on that. But the point I wanted to make was that one of the characteristics of the process that we're working under that's been set out in law is a very tight timetable for finding a solution, and part of the rationale for that, part of the reason for that, is so that we can get to an answer and can give both the local system in terms of the staff that work in it, but also, very importantly, the community that use the local health service, give them confidence that there is a strong future for the NHS in this area. So I'm personally really looking forward to that end point where we can collectively, working with our clinical commissioning groups and GPs and all of the hospitals in this area, really move the story on to a more positive message, which I think is important. Just picking up the point about the economic impact and have we taken account of the changes and how that might affect different groups of people as well. We're doing a piece of work to look at exactly that and to look at how the suggested changes might impact on health inequalities in the area, and looking at how the impact might affect different sorts of people in the community, those that have access to transport, those that don't, those that are more in greater poor health, those that aren't. And that report will be part of the final report that we present to the Secretary of State for Health.
Okay, Anna, there's a gentleman in a pink shirt. Or am I again colourblind? With the big anyway in the front. There we go. Thank you.
I'm Thomas Toll, I'm a local resident. I was just wondering that, from my point of view, part of the problem with what happened with the trust was the lack of accountability to the public. And I was wondering, is there plans in the new trust to create an elected council or government to hold the directors to account?
All right. Lack of accountability in the past and what would happen in the future. Matthew Kershaw.
Okay. So the short answer is we're not specifically going to be recommending changes to the governance of the organisation. But what I would say, and I'm mindful of what I say because not everybody's going to agree with it, very important to say it nonetheless, is that there is an accountability that all NHS organisations have today. There's a group of non-executive directors, board meetings are held in public, etc., etc. One of the things that going forward all providers need to achieve is foundation trust status, and foundation trusts have a slightly different governance structure, not least governors that support that process, both elected by the population, the patients that the trust serves, as well as nominated governors from local authorities and other stakeholder groups. groups. So going forward, the expectation is that for this area, for example, Lewisham and Woolwich organisation to come together. That's a recommendation in draft. If that's accepted and that happens, the key objective for that organisation, as well as providing the best care to patients on a day-to-day basis, implementing these recommendations, will be to achieve Foundation Trust status. What that will allow them to do then is exactly address the issue that you're raising, because as part of that drive, they will get a membership and they will get a set of governance. Now, not everybody is 100% in support of the Foundation Trust approach. I've worked in both non-Foundation Trusts and Foundation Trusts, and I have to say, as a Foundation Trust Chief Exec, I felt more connected to the local population than I did when I worked in an NHS trust, because you would sit in front of your council of governors and your membership on a regular basis, and you'd be directly interacting with them about issues at play. And Stephen, I know, is a Foundation Trust in the Royal Free. I suspect he has a similar sort of experience. So I think there are ways that we can do that, and that would be a consequence of what we're setting out in the report. But what we're not going to do is, in the final report, likely reference a brand new governance structure for this organisation as opposed to others around the NHS. And the final point, clearly, is that there's an accountability in these organisations that also comes through the commissioners. So the commissioners have a strong role in this, and the commissioners themselves, the clinical commissioners, will be holding to account the organisation for what it signs up to doing, and the commissioners themselves have an accountability to local patients, and they have a strong option, because of course they're seeing patients day in, day out in their surgeries, and will be able to test some of this out in their day-to-day conversations, as well as part of their relationship with the provider organisation. So I think there is some ways that we can make all that more accountable than perhaps is felt in the past.
The words NHS Foundation Trust have stirred Professor Stephen Harris, so I've asked to be very brief, because I do want to get a couple of more questions.
So two of the organisational solutions in the document are around King's possibly taking or merging or acquiring one of the hospitals, and Oxley's on the campus. So because they are foundation trusts, they will, if that is accepted, de facto get a set of governors. And those organisations, I think, will have to change the governor representation that they have to reflect the change in geographical area that they cover. So they will have to think very hard about how frequently they take on representatives from Bromley, for example.
All right, thank you very much. Now I'm going to go to, there was a gentleman in grey, yes, behind the gentleman in pink, and then to the lady there with the grey hair. Lovely, I shall salute in that order. First of all, the gentleman with the jumper.
Thank you, my name is Dave Pickerson. I know you can't answer very fully on this, but I think it would be useful to hear a bit more about the transitional plans that you have in mind. You haven't got long to write it, especially with Christmas pudding in between. In terms of the budget, you're saying that some that should be wiped out is as at the end of March 2013. The whole job's got to be done by presumably the end of March 2016. When, for example, do you envisage that the South London Health Trust is dissolved? At what point do you imagine that's going to take place? And that obviously can't take place until other arrangements substituting for it have also been agreed. So perhaps you could say a bit about that. And one last point I'd like to make. If we are going to be able to release some hospital services as a result of people being much better cared for in the community, especially the elderly, it does seem to me we've got to have a considerable transition period to establish those alternative services. I think some of them are probably services that don't exist at the moment. We should be looking at new ways completely. Now, that's going to take some time to do. You've got to, recruit people. You've got to bed down those services. You've got to persuade people that those are the services that they now want to use. And I think that's a particularly big issue.
All right, David.
With elderly people. So are you able to say anything about transitional funding that will allow those services in the community develop, perhaps funding over 3 years.
All right, thank you very much. So I'm going to start off with Matthew Kershaw, and then I might ask Annabelle Byrne to come in. But first of all, Matthew Kershaw.
Thank you. Okay, so let me try and do this quickly so we can get a couple more questions in. We are saying in the report that a transitional plan will be required, and the reason we've said that is for exactly the reasons that you set out. Not to do that, I think, risks us having quite an interesting set of ideas in theory, which remain that, a set of interesting ideas in theory and not ones that actually deliver the change that's required. And I think that would be a mistake. So we're very keen to do the transitional plan. We think that will help assure the decision makers and the population that this will be different and there will be changes and improvements as a result. Now, we are talking about a 3-year programme. Clearly, if we don't provide sufficient funding during that period, 2 things can happen. One is the changes that are required may be delayed / not occur. And the second thing is the new organisations will fall into the financial difficulties that the current organisation is in on the 2nd of April 2013, because there's a deficit today. Unless there are changes, there will be a deficit going forward. So the transitional funding is to help make the changes going forward. It's also to make sure that during the period of transition, the organisations are kept working financially during this period. So there's 2 elements to the transition funding. Both will be addressed in our final report. That's different to another point that you made, Dave, which was around the write-off of some of the historic deficit. We're suggesting that that historic amount is cleared. That's important because it sort of clears the decks for the new organisations. What it doesn't do is it doesn't change by a single penny the challenge going forward. It just means that they haven't got to worry about that element as well as worrying about how to get sustainability going forward. So that's also something we've said. We're saying all of this to give these changes the best possible chance. And why is that so important? Because at the moment, despite best efforts, and going back to the previous question about the morale and the positive aspects of what's going on now, despite all of that work, the organisation, South East London as a system, is in serious financial difficulty. If we do not address that, then we will get to a more concerning position in terms of the quality of care the patients are able to receive. So that's what we're doing. That's how the funding we're going to propose will work. Clearly, we're developing how much that needs to be at this moment. We haven't got a set of decisions that have been made yet, and so we can't just fix that number at this point. We need to wait for the end of the consultation. We need to then consider everything that we've heard. We then need to calculate a figure. That needs to then be proposed to the Secretary of State, and it will be part of the decision he makes about whether or not that's something that he thinks is an appropriate sum. Now, you asked one final quick question about the timetable for dissolution of the organisations. The earliest it could be would be the 1st of April 2013. That's for the change in who runs services. That's not saying the services themselves will change at that time, because they won't. But who runs services could change as quickly as April. There's some neatness to that. It maintains momentum, which I think in this sort of circumstance is important, and also it starts the financial year with a new set of organisations. If it wasn't then, and it doesn't have to be, then it would be a quarter or more after that. So in the NHS you can make changes 1st of April. If it wasn't the 1st of April, it would be the 1st of July. If it wasn't the 1st of July, it would be the 1st of October. We wouldn't be making a set of changes on the 13th of June, for example. It's at the start of every quarter is when it would be. We're working to the 1st of April for organisation change, but if that proves to be impossible to deliver safely and appropriately, then we won't do that, and we'll recommend it to be slightly later than that period.
Annabelle Byrne, did you want to add something from the Greenwich Clinical Commissioning Group?
Yes, so the community-based care strategy that's been put in place has been led by the clinical commissioning groups. And although it does signal a step change in how we do community care, it does build on a lot of work that we've already been doing. One of the early decisions we made when all 6 of us got together was we should move to the best that we were already delivering in South East London. So we weren't coming up with something completely novel that nobody had done. What we'd said is there's some very good practice in South East London, but it's patchy. there's a wide variation. And I think one of the problems for South London Healthcare Trust is that, and particularly Queen Elizabeth, they receive patients from Greenwich, and 40% of their admissions actually come from Bexley. And our community services work in a very, very different way. And so you would have to have a very deep understanding of those different services, say on a Friday night, as to whether somebody works till 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock, and if you're Greenwich or Bexley. And I think because of that variation, what's happened is the hospital hasn't been able to right-size itself. So sometimes it's admitted people where we actually have a service in the community, but that doctor on that night didn't know. So what we've adopted is what we call a principle of shared standards local delivery. So getting a shared standard so that it's much more predictable to all clinicians and to the patients across the patch as to what services they can get in the community. But we absolutely know that they've got to be local services because we work in a very integrated way with our local authority. And the populations are so different, so we deliver services in a different way. So that's the sort of broad answer. But there is a lot of change that needs to take place. And we know in Greenwich we've implemented a lot of community services. So community matrons were only brought in a couple of years ago. And when you first employ a community matron, people don't quite know what they do and what they're there for. And it takes a while for them to get recognised. So absolutely everything you say I agree with. And therefore we're developing a programme of change, which we would be doing anyway. This is part of the plan of services, that we treat more people with long-term conditions more consistently in the community, so they only go to hospital when they really need to. And that we've already got plans quite well advanced for some of those, but it hadn't been consistent across the piece. So we're trying to learn from one another and get those consistent plans in place.
Annabelle, thank you. I think we've got time either for 2 quick questions or one last longer one. And it's the lady on the aisle first of all. I hope it's quick, and then I can be kind to the gentleman over there. Hang on.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to say that I had received very fast, efficient, faultless care last Wednesday. I collapsed. A friend of mine, the enzyme, decided to behave differently. Arriving at the casualty, I was told that you're staying in. I says, I want to go home. I said, we'll see about that tomorrow. Fortunately, I was able to get home, well looked after, and my husband as well. Now, one point was the ambulance people were concerned as would they arrive at the QE in time, because they were closing the doors. The same, and we were the last to be admitted. Then it happened again between, I believe it must have been 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening. The same message went out again, we are closed for admission, which would have meant a further transport, maybe to Farnborough or anywhere else, which is difficult. Now, one point which really upsets me greatly to know that no one goes to hospital for the fun of it. But when you find that you have got transport, you've got your own car and that, you've got to go and put money into the box. Where does that money go to? If it is actually being used properly, or is it simply to give somebody employment? I think it is difficult, really, for a lot of people. They've got to keep going in and out.
All right, you mean the parking charge? You mean the parking charge?
Yes.
Okay, well, let's tackle the first one first about
you
saying QE closing its doors, first of all.
Thank you. I'm glad that overall you had a good experience at QE. I think the vast majority of people do. There's no doubt in London hospital closing that at very peak times, this is true of all EDs, all the accident and emergency departments across London, at very, very peak times, that occasionally what's called a dive was in place where ambulances go to a different hospital rather than local one. This is something done absolutely minimal amount of time as possible, and it's true of all hospitals I know of have this at times. Clearly, it's not the best I think the patients have to do now, but it has been necessary at times to keep the system safe. So I'm glad you made it, and I'm glad you had a good experience overall.
Regarding, just because I want to try and get this gentleman in for one last thing, regarding the car parking, I think it's a very, very quick answer. This is Matthew Kershaw.
It is, just to say that the car parking charges are used to pay the contract that runs those car parks. There's obviously a charge for that, and what that's used for is to provide security, provide personnel, and to maintain the upkeep of the car parks. It's run in this circumstance by a separate company. That's not always the case, but in this circumstance it is as part of the overall arrangements on the site, but that's what it's used for.
Lovely, and we've just time for one very last quick question. This gentleman here.
My name is Chris Taylor, I'm a local resident. I was just wondering, in terms of the debt that's mentioned, you're going to request the Secretary of State to forego the accumulated debt. I assume that's just the deficit that's already built up. I was wondering, given that the straits you're in and the current very low interest rates, whether there's a possibility of a longer or a more dynamic way of making the debt flatten out or disappear to some extent, whether that's in the scope or whether it's
renegotiating the PFI? Is that what you're... Yeah.
To an extent.
I know
the contracts are very, very tight. So what's the connection?
All right, Matthew Kosher.
Yeah, I didn't think we'd get through the whole meeting without the PFI question, quite rightly, because it's an important matter. The PFI issue is a significant part of this problem. Is it the biggest? No. Is it the only one? No. But is it a big issue? It absolutely is, which is why we've made reference to it. The piece around accumulated deficit, that's the debt that's been generated over the past 3 years. We are recommending that that's written off by the Department of Health. That's been done in other places, but it's not something I can just say is going to happen. I have to make recommendations. The Department of Health has to decide whether that's appropriate. In my answer to previous questions, I explained why I thought that was a positive thing. In terms of PFI, what we've done is two things. We've proposed to, in the draft report, that there is a subsidy provided from the Department of Health to the local NHS to cover the gap between what's affordable in terms of paying for the PFI and what it's costing. The reason there's a gap is for a whole host of factors, but there is a gap, and that gap's been identified nationally. It's also been reconfirmed by work that we've done, and we think that's between 20 and 25 million pounds a year, and that's what we set out in the report. In addition to that, we have done further work looking at how the Department of Health, on behalf of the state, so to speak, could enter into discussions with the owners of those PFI contracts, and we'll be providing that information directly to the Department of Health. The reason we're not providing that in the main report is because the people who'd be most interested in receiving that, of course, would be the owners of the PFI contracts themselves, and we think putting it into the main report is probably not the most helpful way of doing it. The best way of doing that is to provide that directly to the Department of Health, and we'll be doing so. So what was really important for me, though, is to say to the local NHS that there's a way of addressing a gap in funding that exists today. It's for the department to then decide how they then take that forward in a slightly different way, longer term, if that's what they choose to do. I think it's important that local NHS knows that there's a way of covering, if my recommendations are accepted, the gap that exists now. That, I think, is a strong and positive aspect of the report. It will only be forthcoming from the department, however, if there's an overall plan that works, because if there isn't, they'll just be throwing another £25 million a year into a black hole, and that's unlikely to be the answer. So it absolutely needs to be part of an overall plan, but if it can be part of an overall plan, as I've set out, then I think that's a positive thing for the local NHS. It's for the system more generally, at a national level, to enter into other conversations that you allude to, and that is certainly part of the work that we've done this February.
All right, I think that pretty much brings us to a close with the 2 hours that we had set out to do. Excuse me, I've got a bad bug. I think it's the air conditioning above me. I wonder if I could just ask Matthew Kershaw just to finish off with concluding a couple of points from this evening before we conclude.
There's one chap at the side who I'll come and talk to as soon as we finish, sir, to make sure we get...
I don't want that.
Sorry, sir.
I had my hand up several times tonight.
Oh, sorry, sir, I apologise. Not done deliberately.
No,
if you could hang around afterwards.
I can see you. I don't see why you can't see me.
Okay,
sorry,
I apologise.
I think there are issues here. No.
All right, do you want to quickly ask it if everyone can hang around another couple of minutes?
Well,
yep, go for it.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I'm Fred Barwick. I'm a local resident in Charlton. I've lived here for 40 years. Seen enormous changes going on. I'm also an ex-teacher, and I've been experienced many reports over the years. And those reports, what's important about them is not the report itself, although that's what everybody wants. the devil is in the detail, as we say, and it's always been the work that's been done outside the report that's important. And I want to know how much of that is going to be published along with your final report, because that seems to me that would underpin your decisions. Secondly, I do have one huge concern here, and I can see the whole of what you're doing, having been a resident here for 40 years and seen both enormous changes in the health services and in population. And the whole demographics of this seem to me to be not totally be taken into account. When I moved here, my parents were the first to move on to Thamesmead. There were, we've had my own ward, which is Riverside next door. It's increased by 10,000 in the last 10 years because of the Arsenal development. Now, I see nothing but more and more population coming into Greenwich and more pressure on services. And I want to know if those have been taken into account, because I think this is very, very important. And I think part of the reason why we're here now is because our services are stretched, because they haven't reacted to those demographic changes over the years. Thank you.
Okay, and then do you want to conclude at the same time? Matthew.
Okay, so in answer to your two short good questions, in terms of the report, how much detail we've provided, well, there's quite a bit of detail, not just not in the consultation document, which is meant to be fairly accessible to the public, it may not always be so, but in the draft report that's on the website, it's a bit like a telephone directory, because there's a lot of appendices in there which covers some of the detail, so do access that if you wish to, because that provides a level of detail that's not in the consultation report. In the final report, we will also be referencing a whole load of detail about the work that's been done alongside the public consultation, because you're absolutely right. There's as much work done in that as there is in anything else, so I wouldn't disagree with you at all. So, for example, I'll just give you one example. For the Queen Elizabeth Hospital and Lewisham coming together, there needs to be a document that sets that out. That's been being discussed as we've been doing consultation, not to preempt the decision, but as somebody else said earlier on, we have 3 weeks from the end of consultation to the Secretary of State having the report on his desk. That allows not enough time for us to do the work after the consultation is finished, so we have to start it in advance and then reflect on the consultation at the end. That's what we'll be doing. That document about how Lewisham and QEH would come together will be in the final report as an appendix. So all of that detail will be there and it will be available in public for people to review. In terms of demographics, it is a really important question, and we have taken into account demographic changes. So one of the questions right at the start was about births. We've taken into account the increase in birth rate that is predicted locally based upon the Commissioner views, but also local authority views on population changes, and that's what we've assumed will continue. There's always a slight difference of opinion about population figures in my experience. Growth is sometimes overestimated, but we have been very careful not to do the alternative, which is as bad if not worse, which is underestimate population growth, because there is anticipated growth in this area, and we need to make sure that's reflected in our modelling, and that's what we try to do. Again, that information is not secret, it's available for people to see what we've used, and we believe we've used an appropriate set of figures based upon conversations we've had with the local council and with the commissioners, who are the people who've got that data. So, hopefully that's answered your question. Apologies, it took time to get to you. So, in terms of a conclusion, thank you all for coming this evening. We've had a useful, informative session. Really grateful for your contributions. It's only by doing these sorts of events that we get to hear directly from the people affected, and that's why these events are so important. As we said at the start, this consultation is your opportunity to contribute to this work. There is only one consultation with this. It finishes on the 13th of December. So if you feel like you've got something more that you want to add to that you've given us verbally today, then please do drop us a line, use the forms that are in the documents, go online and use those. There are further meetings that Gavin will no doubt name check before we finish. all of that comes to a conclusion on the 13th of December. We then have until the 7th of January to write the final report. That goes to the Secretary of State on that day, and it's also published on that day, so people will be able to see it. From the 7th of January then through to the 1st of February, the Secretary of State considers that report, and soon, on the 1st of February or soon thereafter, he then stands up in the House of Parliament and makes an announcement about the way forward. That's the way the process works. We believe the current situation is one that can't continue, as it's financially unviable at this point, and that's going to, we believe, have an impact on the clinical quality able to provide to patients going forward. What we've set out is a number of changes that, taken together, will bring the improvements in patient outcomes and the financial position that we need to do, but also importantly that you deserve, and that's why we set out the recommendations that we have. We look forward to receiving your final comments on what you've heard this evening and any other contributions you wish to make to the consultation. Thank you again for coming, and safe journeys home.